a brief introduction to a book that's coming out on, I think on Thursday, called In the Long Run, The Future as a Political Idea. I guess very roughly, this is a book about how ideas of the future are used and abused in politics and what implications that may have for democracy, tracing this story, well, historically from the 18th century, but with an accent, of course, on the present. So you can see the cover of the book there. It's a cover that has a tortoise on it, which, of course, to some degree is the whims of a publisher. But I think there's also perhaps something that one can tease out of this tortoise, especially in a room which has some resonance with the Fabians. I think when we think of a tortoise, clearly it's got a long cultural association with ideas of time and questions of how much time we have. And of course, if you go back to ancient Greek fables of the hare and the tortoise, the answer of the tortoise is, of course, we have plenty of time for deliberation, for perseverance. And the Romans, of course, pick up this term with the idea of hasten slowly, festina lente. So the tortoise, I guess, is emblematic of a certain way of approaching time with an accent on its plenitude. Well, the book, I guess, the guiding intuition of the book is that these questions of how much time we have are ones that run through much politics and have political and democratic implications. And answers, of course, have varied over time to that, from the 18th century and a revolutionary period, where, of course, the accent was on immediacy. The time available is the time in the present and the near future to push through far-reaching change, through into the 19th, 20th century, where the accent is very much on what you might call an indefinite future, a future which is long. I mentioned the Fabians, and of course the Fabians adopt as their emblem the tortoise as being a political current interested in, if you like, the long struggle as opposed to simply the revolutionary moment. The Fabian tortoise is accompanied by this interesting motto that says, "When I strike hard." By the way, there's an image there called the Fabian window. I've been looking while people were filing in to see if there's a tortoise in the Fabian window. I haven't yet seen the tortoise, but maybe he's under some undergrowth somewhere. When I strike hard. Perhaps this idea that playing the long game of the tortoise always risks losing any sense of radical politics, and this motto, "When I do strike, I strike hard," almost as if to assuage the idea that working in the long run is something that can temper any radical politics. And I guess that's always been the question for the Fabians. To what extent do they ever strike? Do this current of kind of evolutionary left-wing thought rely too much on an indefinite future rather than that immediacy of the revolutionary moment? And I think going into the present, these are live questions which we very much live in today. We are perhaps far from this idea of an indefinite future, which I think characterizes not just the age of Fabians, but many political movements of the late 19th and the 20th century, and also theories of capitalism. I think you could call the present something, by contrast, as an age of temporal claustrophobia, compression, a sense of running out of time, and indeed of finality, of every moment potentially being, if not the last, then of decisive significance, whether that's to do with climate change, whether that's to do with escalating economic inequalities, whether it's to do with geopolitics. So this is a book that tries to investigate dichotomies such as that between the long term and the near term, that sense of the indefinite future or that sense of the very compressed future, along with a series of other dichotomies that I think run through politics in the modern period and into the present, and to think about what they imply, as I say, for politics and for democracy. So what makes the future something political? I guess there's a sense in which the future isn't always something that we approach as something political. Very often when we as individuals think about the future, we perhaps have an eye to things of essentially personal concern, to do with finding a job, finding a partner, concerns of illness and mortality, and so on. Now, of course, you could say that all of these things are, in some sense, deeply political insofar as expectations are shaped by the powerful, by currents in society that go beyond any individual. But insofar as we think of the future as individuals and about personal prospects, maybe that political element is at least one step removed. But of course, a lot of thinking about the future, and especially that which interests me in this book, is the future as thought about in groups, in movements, in political parties, in things which are, if you like, group forms of thinking about the future, which I think they merge together historically. The emergence of group forms of politics, such as movements and parties in the 17th, 18th century, is, I think, and I try to suggest in the book, connected to changing ideas of time, changing ideas of the future, a future that can be reshaped, a future likely to be different from the present. There's a lot of historiography, of course, on this exact question of changing expectations in the 18th century. And as I try to show, ideas of the future are politically important for those emerging collective forms of doing politics. The future as an idea is something that can offer perspective on the present. Clearly, the utopian literature of the 18th century, 19th century, and onwards is very much about putting a spotlight on the present by thinking about how things could be different in the future, from 18th century utopian literature such as Louis-Sébastien Mercier through to a whole range of utopian but also dystopian and ultimately science fictional accounts of the future. They offer, if you like, a point of contrast and a perspective from which to think about structural change and not just change of individuals. Clearly, ideas of the future can be a source of shared identity, shared understanding as a collective. The isms of the 19th century, socialism, liberalism, and indeed nationalism, are, if you like, all forms of thought around which groups can cohere, and that interchange between them thinking of the future collectively and reinforcing their collectivity through their shared sense of fate is one which I think you can certainly trace through the 19th century and onwards. Sociologists of protest, before ideas of the future become central to politics, often say that protest, for example, in the medieval period, in medieval Europe, is about scattered sparks of protest. It is about particular grievances aimed at particular individuals, landlords, those thought to be hoarding food in the context of famine, and so on. You might say that ideas of the future and the capacity to synthesize them as isms is exactly what allows protests, forms of critique, to move beyond that very local in space, local in time, to something which is able to broaden itself, as exactly politics of the 19th and 20th century does. So ideas of the future are something that helps to delocalize politics, to generalize claims, I think, are also a central theme of the book. And finally, if we talked about perspective, talked about shared identity, I think it's also worth emphasizing ideas of the future as a source of commitment, as ways of thinking about persevering with projects that take time to realize, things that cannot be achieved overnight. Those are all things you might say are ways in which ideas of the future intersect with particular political causes. But my claim is also that ideas of the future have a particular significance for democracy. In other words, stepping back from a particular political cause or to the cause of democracy itself. Modern democracy is, of course, representative democracy. And representative democracy has certain particular features about it, the importance of mediating institutions, the importance of conflict, adversarialism, things that in an ancient ideal of the democracy of the forum you might hope to transcend. In the context of representative democracy, these things are characteristic. And of course, representative democracy is in some sense always imperfect, because it is never possible to represent all interests, all values at any one moment. There's always a loss that is accompanied by representation. And it seems to me that these features are exactly something that gives representative democracy in particular a certain reliance, you might say, on ideas of the future. Why, for example, should people accept election results that they don't seem to agree with, that don't seem to further the ends that they approve of? How does one legitimize representative democracy? Of course, one of the long-standing answers to that lies in what the political scientists would call losers' consent, which is founded on the idea that the next time can be a correction to the failings of this time. In other words, that if this particular election results in malevolent or undesirable forces becoming politically dominant, that there is some notion of a future in which contestation can continue, and that the problems, the severe imperfections of the present can be, if not rectified, then at least contested. So if representative democracy has this feature of disagreement, has this feature of institutional imperfection, because representation always comes with a loss of some kind, then you might say, well, it's exactly by relying on the future as a source of the remedy of the failures of any particular moment that you can hope to legitimize such an arrangement. Well, as I said, this is a book that, on the one hand, is interested in the historical emergence of such ideas and how they play out across time, but it's also a book that's interested in what's specific to the present. And as I said a moment ago, I think there is a sense in which the present is exactly a moment when some of these ideas break down. This idea of the future as a resource for rectifying the limitations of representative democracy at any moment is, of course, going to be challenged to the extent that people lose confidence in the future or start to treat each political contest as something like the last. Trump talks about the upcoming election as the final battle. Much more generally, I think there is a sense of emergency, which we're all familiar with, that hangs across so much of contemporary politics, a sense of irreversible change, a sense of things coming to some type of conclusion. Now, of course, there is no agreement in politics about which emergency is the real emergency, the key emergency, the dominant one. You could almost say that there are emergencies of the left, climate change, economic equality. There are emergencies of the right to do with demographics, to do with cultural change and felt cultural decline. You might even continue this thought and say maybe there are emergencies of the centre, whether it's, I don't know, to do with geopolitics or AI. Well, we don't have to argue about what emergency to put in what place, but this notion of disagreement about emergencies, I think, is very characteristic of the present. But it's also the common thread is this sense, from a wide variety of perspectives across the political spectrum, of time running out, of being unable to rely on that future as a place of correction or as a place in which one can projects of change on the model of party politics of the 19th and 20th century. As I tried to show towards the end of the book, this sense of emergency, which is found in so many different corners of contemporary politics, is on the one hand a reflection of the material challenges that contemporary societies face, which of course are different in different parts of the world. But I think they are also, this kind of emergency outlook, you might say, is a reflection of a felt sense of powerlessness that replicates itself across so much of contemporary democratic politics. Things become emergencies when you feel powerless to address them. And that's something which you find partly, I think, within governing circles, officials fighting things as emergencies because they doubt their capacity to ultimately deal with them, whether that's to do with weakness of state capacity, whether it's to do with the external drivers of the problems in question, whether it's to do with constitutional restraints, such as, think of Germany recently, the constitutional restraints on spending that almost force the government to try and justify its expenditure in exceptionist terms, emergency spending. But if this is something that you find within governing officials, I think it's only stronger amongst those outside the corridors of power, for whom that sense of powerlessness is all the stronger, and perhaps often coupled by a sense that officials are fighting the wrong emergency or simply not doing anything, but often a sense of disagreement about which emergency is the crucial one. So I would characterize this as exactly an expression of what you might say as politics where that confidence in the future is very much attenuated and expresses itself in this sense of, well, electoral politics is almost like a referendum. A referendum is that type of political moment which is not expected to be repeated. It's not about this time and next time, those terms in which I referred a moment ago to the legitimization of representative democracy. The referendum, of course, is meant to be a standalone moment. The idea of a next time is often thought of as, at least at any foreseeable timetable, something rather absurd, something that undermines the authority of the referendum at any particular moment. So electoral politics starts to, when you lose this sense of the indefinite future, this is going to have consequences for electoral politics. It's politics that then played out in these highly harsh, adversarial, but not just adversarial, I would say intolerant terms. The suspicion of institutions, the suspicion of adversaries as enemies, the existentialization of conflicts, I think has everything to do with that felt sense of temporal claustrophobia, as I referred to it before, the sense of time running out, the loss of the future as a resource on which to temper the politics of the present. That, of course, you might say can be entirely attractive, going back to that idea of the revolutionary outlook as one that's all about the immediacy of the moment, the urgency of the moment. So there is a sense in which that expectation of the indefinite future is something that is almost at odds with political agency, something that can invite too lethargic, too tortoise-like an approach to politics. But at the same time, I think it's something that can be very problematic because radical politics requires structural change, and that requires a sense of a longer-term program that goes beyond the climate deadlines of the present, the 5 years, the 7 years, whatever, requires a sense of a longer future. And of course, even before that, politics, when you have a sense of no time, often loses the sense of ideas. The politics of ideas becomes a politics of identity, of preserving what you have in a given moment, because there's no time for lofty ideals when you are feeling that sense of temporal constraint. So the politics of identity is something that becomes much more important than the politics of ideas. I again would say has got something to do with this outlook on the future that is brought by emergencies and the powerlessness that underlies them. The very end of the book, therefore, is an effort to think about what it might mean to find time for democracy under these conditions, both the fatalism of disengagement from politics, but also the fascism that can come from this emphasis on preservation of identity, of charismatic politics as the politics of the immediate moment, as opposed to the ideational politics as the politics of a longer term. These are things which I think can easily become central stage when you have this sense of disempowerment through contemporary politics and the loss, if you like, of convincing, plausible ideas of the longer-term project being promoted from the left, or indeed from the centre-left. So, to conclude, many people talk about the present as short-termist. This critique of short-termism, I think, is one that we encounter quite often, and somehow speaks to the themes that I'm describing. But for me, and this is, I think, the general tenor of this book, we shouldn't approach that so much in terms of cultural shifts alone, sort of some shift from modernity to post-modernity, nor should we necessarily approach it as a problem of psychology. If only people could just think a little bit harder to think about the long-term interests of future generations, as opposed to being selfish and thinking about the now. This is the book that tries to show that, no, this is something that is also bound up in politics and power, and that this attenuation of the sense of the longer term is driven, at least in significant part, by the weakening of the organizations that have, over modern politics, been the best source of reassurance and confidence about the future. Movements, political parties, things which are built to endure, which are meant to, if you like, embody a long-term cause, give the individual reason to think that they're contributing to something that can outlast them. As parties, as movements become weaker in that sense, then there's every reason to expect this type of shortening of horizons, this accentuation of politics as emergency that I've been describing. So the book ends then suggesting that rather than, as I say, think about simply psychological exhortations to think longer term, to try and escape the time horizons of present politics, it's also got to be about countering that sense of powerlessness that turns problems into emergencies, that makes people want a resolution in the now for things that otherwise they might be willing to see as the foundation for a continuing political project. That could be the democratization or the redemocratization of political parties. That can be new forms of political collective future making to do with reviving trade unions, whatever. But this emphasis, I think, I want to leave you with is that these time horizons have all to do with how we do politics. It's not just a question of thinking long-term, trying to escape short-termist horizons, but organizing for the long-term. The tortoise, I guess, is either a model to us in that respect, but as I say, a model with its pitfalls, because long-term politics is something that can also lose some of its radicalism. It's the art of balancing these different dichotomies, which is at the core of this book. I'll stop there. Thank you.